I don't want to go back. For much of my life, I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I was just the same me, but maybe 1 or 2 years younger. I got into school at a slightly higher age, so I always was one of the oldest ones. And the same was true for then high school. And the same was true then for university. There will always be these people that basically were at the same state as I was in the same kind of scenario, which would be in school in the same study course, but they were actually younger. In university, then there were people that were 2 or 3 years younger. But then, if I go through the actual implications of what it would mean to be younger, it would mean that I would not have experienced basically 1 or 2 years of my life. Instead, I would basically just not have experienced this. Now, of course, another underlying assumption would have been that I would have been kind of the same me, just without these additional years, but probably I wouldn't be. So if I would change, then if I basically would be younger, actually right now I would be not as old as I am now, but 1 or 2 years younger, then I would not be at the same stage as I am now, because if I assume the same genes and I assume somewhat similar situations, then I basically would be at the same state as I am now, but 2 years earlier. So I would not be at the same state as I am now, but it would take me 2 more additional years. But then again, there are other factors, such as technology potentially increasing how much problems I am able to solve. So if one thinks about life as a series of problems one has to go through, then one could assume now, if my computer, for example, is a little bit faster because I am born 2 years later, then at the same age at least, I would probably have solved a little bit more problems. But then again, I am also quite grateful that I was born before technology became so much woven into our everyday lives, and I am glad that I was able to spend maybe 2 years more without Instagram or without YouTube and so on and so forth. So, and also without text messaging. So basically, when I was in elementary school, I called people after school whether they wanted to spend the afternoon playing with me. And I also sometimes asked them in school already whether they wanted to play with me. I also sometimes called just multiple friends because, well, what else was there to do in the afternoon? So I am very glad that I had to do this. I'm very glad that I had to talk to their parents, that I had to talk to their sisters, their brothers, because usually they were not the ones that were taking the phone call, and there was just one landline. Now, there are also a couple of other factors which I also want to mention. And here I again come back to this problem of, not this problem, but this perspective of having to go through all of these problems. If I just imagine now math problems, and these math problems are actually not math problems, but these are the actual problems I had to solve, then I think in many areas of my life, I'm basically at the best possible. So I think basically as I go through time, that I am now in many areas at kind of a very good stage compared to before. And I would not want to exchange this very good state to a potentially worse state. A practical example would be that I've now been using nutrition for multiple months or maybe years that kind of is the best that it has ever been. So I basically was never on a better nutrition, one could say. I think at least as far as I can compute this. And the same would be true for my notebook, for example. I would not want to change to the older notebook again. And the same would be true for this apartment, for example. This is the best apartment I have ever lived in, one could say. Of course, I was also with my parents and so on and so forth, and I don't want to miss this. But in terms of living outside of this is the best apartment. This is the best situation ever that I have encountered yet. And so there are so many things in which it seems that with increasing years, there is just a growth rate, and that then leads to a better outcome. Now, the big down factor, of course, is that I am now older. That I am actually older. But what if it wouldn't matter? Now, I've listened to and watched many, and also read a few books or listened to a few books on this topic in the last years, and it seems that technology might not potentially solve, but potentially reduce basically take these two variables or these two processes, age as well as decline in health, and basically separate them out such that you could be older, but biologically younger. And so what I've been trying to do, at least in one of my interests, is and this is basically now, so fitness and sport and all of what I do in regards to this, diet, nutrition, sleep, exercise, has been kind of moving towards this one target. I in the last couple of months and years was able to kind of streamline it towards this one target, which would be to reduce my speed of aging. Now, of course, I am not so far into this that I measure this continuously. So there is a DNA methylation test one could already take, which seems to be the kind of standard. I also took a blood test, which then came out for me age 37 or 36, which is 10 years above my actual age or 9 years above my actual age. And so this has been not so great. But in terms of, if I take a look at my fitness markers, for example, and I put in my VO2 max estimate from Garmin and my strength 1 rep max strength tests, then there is an app from my gym, and this says that I am actually 4 years younger or 3 years younger than my chronological age. So if I could be the same me, but I could potentially eliminate or at least reduce the negative aspects of aging, then I think I would again choose to be me. The only big difference would be, now of course now there is also something else implied, which is if there is somebody who is in a similar position as I am, and he is 2 years younger, then he probably went through all these computational problems at a faster rate. So he potentially would be more intelligent, or he would be in other ways superior to me. So in a certain way, one could interpret this wish as to wanting to be younger, as wanting to have kind of superior genes in this regard, because to a certain extent, or maybe it's genes and then how hard one works, and he just worked harder, could also be the case. And therefore I did not, but then again, there are so many threads that seem to come together in this tapestry that is the result, or the conclusion that maybe much of what I think I am actually planning and executing is not so much me, but much more my subconscious, and that I might not have that many choices anyway. And so there are these experiments where people try to click a button or something like this, and from their brain readouts, one could predict up to 7 seconds before, in certain situations, what they actually already were deciding, but they at this point in time did not think they were deciding this, but you could already read the decision basically. So they came to the conclusion after the brain came to the conclusion. So to a certain extent, one could say this free agent that one is or has is only to a certain extent thinking that it is free. And if I apply this to myself, then I might have to acknowledge that maybe I just had to go through all of these situations I had to go through. Now, of course, my life would have been different if I went through other situations, but also similar to the time traveling paradox, which I came up once. Now, this might have been influenced by something else, but here is the paradoxon. So if I would be time traveling, if I would be able to time travel, then as soon as I leave the world I am living in, I'm basically no longer me. Now, not necessarily at this point already, but if I would be time traveling and I would travel to another time back in the same timeline, then I would change something, then the timeline I would go back to is basically no longer the timeline. And there would be multiple implications, there would be multiple versions, which would be that I would now replace the me that is actually living in this timeline, which then would cause basically a discrepancy in the knowledge I have, because I now know that I basically killed this person, which would be me in the other timeline, or the other person then continues to exist, but this would mean that as soon as I decide to travel back in time, that I actually would be the one that is dying. So time traveling in this regard would be suicide. And this paradoxon, to a certain extent, I think just shows the implications of changing maybe a tiny little thing. Of course, one could argue maybe if I change whether I wore this cap yesterday once more or once less, does not necessarily have the biggest impact, and there are things that might have more impact and might have less impact. But there is also this thing known as the butterfly effect, which is not necessarily a scientific hypothesis or something like this, but it's the idea that if there is a butterfly and it flaps his wings once, then it might cause basically it might cause a stirring up of the air in this regard, and this might cause a tornado on the other side of the earth or something like this. And so maybe I don't want to exchange the life I have now for the life I otherwise would have had if I actually would have been younger.